Good morning, students. As part of preparation for pre-board exams, we have started explaining the short notes type of details of life process chapter. In the last class, we have discussed about nutrition. In today's class, let us discuss about respiration. I am not going to explain point to point details, but in a crisp manner, only important points I am going to discuss here. If you take a syringe type thing and pump the air into lime water, then the lime water turns into milky white after some time. And if you take a small tube like thing and blow air through your mouth into lime water, then also the lime water turns into milky white. What is the difference between these two experiments? When you blow the air with your mouth into the lime water, the lime water is turning into milky white. And when you blow the atmospheric air, when you just infuse the atmospheric air through a syringe into lime water, then also the lime water is turning into milky white. The difference between these two experiments is time gap. The air enters into lime water and lime water is turning into milky white in both the experiments. But after infusing the air, how much time that it takes for the lime water to turn into milky white? That is going to be different from blowing of air with your mouth and blowing of air through the syringe. When the air is blown into lime water through the syringe, the time gap that it takes for the lime water to get converted into milky white color is more than when the air is blown into lime water by your mouth. What actually making the lime water to turn into milky white? CO2. So, if the CO2 is more, then the time that it is going to take for the lime water to convert into milky white is less. If CO2 is less, then the time that it takes for the lime water to turn into milky white is more. So, these two experiments explain that atmospheric air contains less CO2 than our exhaled air. Okay. By respiration, energy is created from the food that we take. Respiration is of mainly two types, aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic respiration is the respiration in which oxygen is used to break down the glucose completely. Anaerobic respiration is the type of respiration in which the breakdown of glucose does not involve oxygen. So, if the respiration is involving the oxygen, it is called aerobic. If respiration is not involving oxygen, that is called anaerobic respiration. In both aerobic and anaerobic respirations, the first step is common, in which oxygen is not utilized. In the first step, what happens? Glucose is broken down into two pyruvate molecules. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule which is broken down into two 3-carbon molecules. Two 3-carbon molecules. Pyruvate is 3-carbon molecule. So two pyruvates are formed by the breakdown of glucose in the first step of both aerobic and anaerobic respirations. And so first step is common in both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Second step is different in aerobic and anaerobic respirations. Let us discuss about anaerobic respiration only. Second step of anaerobic respiration. So the first step, breakdown of glucose into two pyruvate. It happens in cytoplasm. In anaerobic respiration, second step also takes place in cytoplasm only. This occurs in two different ways, in two different conditions, or into different types of cells. First type, the pyruvate is converted into one molecule of ethanol and one molecule of CO2. Ethanol is 2-carbon molecule, CO2 is 1-carbon molecule. So pyruvate is 3-carbon molecule. So 3C is broken down into 2C plus 1C. Generally, it happens in some bacteria and yeast-like organisms. Anaerobic respiration is generally called fermentation. Since ethanol is alcohol, this type of anaerobic respiration is called alcoholic fermentation. Sir, where energy is produced? Energy is produced in the second step as well as in the first step. Okay. But here in anaerobic respiration, generally energy is not produced. Whatever the energy that is produced by the first step, that itself is the final energy. And second type of anaerobic respiration, one pyruvate molecule is converted into one lactic acid molecule, which generally occurs in oxygen deprived muscle cells. This is also called lactic acid fermentation. Here also same type. Whatever the energy that is produced in the first step, that is the final energy. In aerobic respiration, one pyruvate molecule is broken down into 3 carbon dioxide molecules. Unlike second step of anaerobic respiration, the second step of aerobic respiration takes place in mitochondria. In anaerobic respiration, less energy is produced, and in aerobic respiration, high energy is produced. The energy that is produced is utilized to synthesize ATP. This ATP fuels all activities that takes place inside the cell. When ATP is broken down, energy is released. And this energy is utilized by the endothermic reactions of cells. Endothermic means energy consuming reactions of the cells. The energy that is released from respiration is used to make ATP. This ATP is made by the combining of ADP and inorganic phosphate. The full form of ATP is adenosine triphosphate. The full form of ADP is adenosine diphosphate. PI refers inorganic phosphate. So ATP is formed from ADP and inorganic phosphate. When terminal phosphate of ATP is broken using water, then 30.5 kilojoule per mole energy is released. So by the breakdown of ATP, by the breakdown of terminal phosphate of ATP. How much energy is produced? 30.5 kilojoule per mole is released. And how this ATP is broken down? By the addition of water. By the addition of water, if any molecule is broken down, such reaction is known as hydrolysis reaction. Hydrolysis, simply to speak. So ATP is broken down, or terminal phosphate of ATP is broken down by hydrolysis. In plants, separate respiratory organs are absent. But plants are multicellular organisms. We have learned that in unicellular organisms, the entire surface of the cell is in direct contact with the environment, so that by means of diffusion itself, the cell gets the oxygen and it emits out the carbon dioxide that is formed by the respiration. What about plants where respiratory organs are absent, unlike in developed animals? All cells' environment is not in direct contact with the environment, but generally in the plant body, the living cells are arranged loosely so that large intercellular spaces are present. These intercellular spaces ensure that all cells are in contact with air. The CO2 and O2 are exchanged by diffusion only in plants. So, though plants are complex multicellular organisms, and though they do not have any respiratory organs, the air can enter inside the cells due to the presence of large intercellular spaces. And gases exchange, that is, intake of O2 and release of carbon dioxide, occurs by means of diffusion only. As the large intercellular spaces are present, cells are in contact with air. This ensures that the CO2 and O2 are really exchanged by diffusion. And in plants, the direction of diffusion, it depends on environmental conditions. Environmental conditions means daytime, particular type of environmental conditions will be there. Night time, another particular type of environmental conditions will be there. Based on these, during the night time, CO2 elimination is the major event, and during daytime, O2 elimination is the major event, because during daytime, photosynthesis occurs rapidly and respiration does not occur rapidly, and it may occur slowly. So the amount of O2 that it is released by photosynthesis is more than the amount of CO2 that it is released by the respiration. So during the daytime, oxygen release is the major event. During the night time, photosynthesis may not take place, so the amount of O2 that it is released is almost nil, whereas the CO2 that it is released by respiration will be full. So nighttime CO2 release is the major event. Based on this only, the direction of diffusion means either release of CO2 or release of O2, which is going to be major, that it is dependent on environmental conditions. In animals, especially terrestrial animals and aquatic animals, two types of animals are there. If the animal is of terrestrial type, the terrestrial animals breathe in atmospheric oxygen, and the aquatic animals breathe in dissolved oxygen. The amount of oxygen in the form of dissolved oxygen is very low, or lower than atmospheric oxygen. So the breath rate of aquatic animals is much faster than the terrestrial animals. Example, fishes. We can observe how the fish will keep opening its mouth so frequently. Accordingly, the gills also are opened, right? So fish take the air through their gills, and they make that air to pass through the blood vessels that are present inside the gills, and the oxygen will be taken into those blood vessels or blood capillaries, and CO2 will be given out, and that CO2 rich air will be coming out through the mouth. So only the opening of mouth and gills are synchronized, and the rate of that opening, if we observe, it is much faster than the terrestrial animals. Okay. In terrestrial animals, the organs, respiratory organs, have specific structure that increases the surface area that is in contact with the oxygen-rich atmosphere. This surface area is very thin and delicate, as gaseous exchange has to occur across this surface. In order the gaseous exchange process to occur across this surface area in the respiratory organ is thin and delicate. As it is thin and delicate, it is easily, or it may easily get damaged if it is present outside. So this surface area containing respiratory organ is generally present inside the body because it has to be protected. So the surface has to be protected. It has to be protected. So it is present inside the body. So when this surface area for gaseous exchange is present inside the body, and the air that contains oxygen is present outside the body, then how this surface is going to get the air from the environment to this area? Some passages are present, air passages are present. These air passages bring the air, oxygen-rich air, to the surface, and then gaseous exchange occurs. In humans, this air passages include nostrils, nasal passage, then bronchi, bronchioles, then alveoli. In humans, the nostrils are the opening of this air passage, which lead to nasal passage. Nostrils lead to nasal passage. In the nasal passage, fine hairs and mucus are present. These fine hair and mucus, they filter the air so that dust particles do not enter into the lungs. And these nasal passages lead to throat. This throat is made up of rings of cartilage. These rings of cartilage ensure that air passage does not collapse. And this throat or the trachea or the windpipe leads to lungs. Inside the lungs, this air passage divides into smaller tubes, that is bronchi and bronchioles, and finally these bronchioles terminate into alveoli, that is balloon-like structures. And at these alveoli, gaseous exchange occurs. Alveoli are having extensive network of blood capillaries into which this oxygen-rich air enters, and from them the CO2-rich air is taken. But how air enters inside and how air exits outside? The entry of air into lungs is known as inhalation. Inhalation occurs when our ribs are lifted up and the diaphragm is made flatten. When ribs are lifted up and diaphragm is made flatten, the chest cavity becomes larger. And exhalation, when ribs are flattened and diaphragm is lifted up, the chest cavity becomes smaller. Then what happens? The air will move out. Even after exhalation also, lungs always contain residual volume of air in it. This is known as tidal volume. This residual volume of air allows sufficient time for the oxygen to be absorbed and CO2 to be released. By means of diffusion, if this air has to move to all the cells in human body, it takes years together of time. So, for the transport of oxygen from lungs to all the cells, and for the transport of CO2 from all the cells back to the lungs, specific arrangement is there, that is blood. Blood inside the red blood cells is having hemoglobin. This hemoglobin is the oxygen carrier. So oxygen is carried to all the cells by being bound to hemoglobin. And CO2 from all the cells is carried back to the lungs by being dissolved in blood plasma. Why the CO2 is carried by being dissolved in blood plasma, and why the oxygen is carried by being bound to hemoglobin? The solubility of oxygen in blood plasma is very low, so it cannot be carried in sufficient quantity by being dissolved in blood plasma. Whereas the solubility of CO2 in blood plasma is very high, so that it can be carried from all the body cells back to the lungs by being dissolved in blood plasma. This is how the respiratory gases are carried in between lungs and the body cells. With this, our respiration topic is completed. In the next class, let us discuss transportation followed by excretion. Keep preparing well. Thank you.